I raised her for 21 years. Yesterday, she introduced me as her aunt to a man who died 2 decades ago. But the look in his eyes, he wasn't a ghost. He was a predator, and my daughter was his hunter. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold. Stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The air in the Eco Hotel ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive oud and the humidity of a Lagos night, a cloying mixture that usually signaled success for Nneka. She smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, her eyes tracking her daughter, Amara, across the room. Amara was the sun, radiant, 21, and possessed of a grace that felt almost otherworldly. For 2 decades, Nneka had been her anchor, the woman who had wiped every tear and funded every dream. But as a tall, silver-haired man approached Amara, the air in Nneka's lungs seemed to crystallize into shards of glass. She watched them speak, saw the way Amara leaned in, a gesture of intimacy usually reserved for her mother. When Nneka finally glided over, ready to reclaim her place, the world didn't just tilt, it inverted. Amara turned, her smile practiced and bright, and placed a hand on the man's arm. "Julian, I don't believe you've met her properly," Amara said, her voice like a cool stream over jagged rocks. "This is Nneka, my aunt. She's been so kind to look after me all these years." The word aunt struck Nneka with the force of a physical blow, leaving a ringing in her ears that drowned out the jazz band's upbeat tempo. The man, Julian, didn't flinch. He looked at Nneka with eyes that had haunted her dreams since 2005, eyes she had been told were closed forever beneath the red earth of an Enugu cemetery. His gaze wasn't one of a stranger, but of a conqueror returning to a city he had already razed. He took Nneka's cold hand, his grip firm, his skin warm in a way a dead man's should never be. "Aunt Nneka," he repeated, the name sounding like a slur in his mouth. "Amara has told me so much about your hospitality." Nneka felt the sweat prickling at her hairline, the expensive makeup suddenly feeling like a mask that was melting off. She wanted to scream, to grab Amara by the shoulders, and demand to know why the word mother had been stripped from her identity in a single breath. But she was a woman of the Lagos elite, and in this world, public displays of trauma were the ultimate sin. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, watching as her daughter, the girl she had birthed from her heart, if not her womb, walked away with a man who was supposed to be a memory, leaving Nneka standing alone in a room full of people who had no idea they were witnessing a kidnapping of the soul. The drive back to Ikoyi was conducted in a silence, so heavy it felt like a third passenger in the car. Nneka gripped the steering wheel of her Range Rover, her knuckles white, while Amara hummed a low, melodic tune, staring out at the neon lights of the third mainland bridge. Nneka wanted to speak, to demand an explanation for the aunt comment, but a cold, instinctual fear kept her tongue tied. As soon as they entered the house, Amara drifted upstairs with a casual "good night, auntie," leaving the word hanging in the air like a poison mist. Nneka didn't go to bed. Instead, she went straight to the heavy mahogany desk in her study. She needed the comfort of the file, the thick, cream-colored envelope that contained the legal proof of her motherhood. Her fingers trembled as she punched the code into the floor safe. The heavy door swung open with a metallic groan, but as she reached inside, her hand met only cold air and the velvet lining. The file was gone. The adoption papers, the birth certificate, the court orders, the entire paper trail of Amara's life had vanished as if it had never existed. In the place where the documents should have been, there sat a single, small object that made Nneka's heart stutter. It was a faded plastic hospital bracelet, the kind used for newborns. She picked it up, her breath hitching. The plastic was yellowed with age, but the ink was still legible. It didn't list Nneka as the mother. It didn't even list her sister, Chitty. Under the section for parental information, there is only one name written in a sharp, masculine script, Julian Silas. Below the bracelet lay a Polaroid photo, fresh and glossy, as if taken only hours ago. It showed Amara and Julian sitting in a cafe Nneka didn't recognize, their heads bent together in a conspiratorial huddle. On the back, written in Amara's unmistakable, elegant handwriting, were the words, "The truth doesn't need a signature." Nneka sank to the floor, the cold marble chilling her skin. The realization began to settle in like a slow-acting venom. This wasn't a mistake or a temporary lapse in judgment. Amara hadn't just found Julian. She had invited him back to dismantle Nneka's world, piece by agonizing piece. The next morning, the Lego sun was an intruder, spilling across the floor of Nneka's study and highlighting the emptiness of the safe. She hadn't slept, her mind a frantic loop of Julian's face and the missing papers. She went to her office in Victoria Island early, hoping the routine of her real estate empire would ground her, but the ghost followed her. He didn't sneak in. He walked through the front door of the glass and steel building, charming her receptionist with the same effortless charisma that had shattered Nneka's heart 20 years ago. When he walked into her private office, he didn't wait for an invitation to sit. He leaned against the doorframe, looking at the framed photos of Amara on Nneka's desk, photos of childhood he had missed, or so Nneka had thought. "You've done well for yourself, Nneka," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "The house in Ikoyi, the business, the daughter." "My daughter." Nneka stood up, her hands flat on the desk to hide their shaking. "She is mine, Julian. I signed the papers. I raised her while you were, wherever you were hiding." Julian laughed, a dry, hollow sound that contained no mirth. He walked toward the desk, leaning over until Nneka could smell the faint scent of rain and tobacco on his skin. "You signed papers provided by your father, Nneka. Did you ever wonder why the lawyer died a month later? Or why the clinic burned down?" He reached out, his finger tracing the edge of a photo of Amara. "You were a convenient vessel, a way to keep the child safe while the adults settled their debts. But I'm here now, and I'm tired of being a ghost." Nneka felt a wave of nausea. She remembered her father's insistence on the adoption, his urgency to clean up Chitty's mess after the accident. She had been the grieving sister, the one who stepped up, the one who stayed. "She thinks I'm her aunt," Nneka whispered, the words tasting like ash. Julian leaned closer, his eyes cold as stones. "That was her idea, Nneka. She's been writing to me for 3 years. She's the one who told me it was time to come home. You weren't protecting her from me. You were keeping her from her inheritance. And as for loving you, that was never part of the plan. You were just the bridge." The memory of the 2005 rainy season in Enugu always tasted like wet earth and metallic ozone in Nneka's mouth. It was the year the world stopped spinning, or at least the year the lie began its slow, suffocating growth. Chitty, Nneka's younger sister, had always been the light to Nneka's shadow, vibrant, reckless, and possessed of a beauty that seemed to irritate their traditionalist father. Nneka remembered the night of the accident with a clarity that felt like a recurring fever dream. The headlights cutting through the torrential downpour on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, the screech of tires that sounded like a dying animal, and the subsequent silence that was far more terrifying than the crash itself. She had been told by her father, a man whose reputation was built on iron-fisted control and a lack of transparency, that Chitty and her lover had perished instantly when their car veered into the ravine. The grief had been a physical weight, a leaden shroud that Nneka wore as she sat through the closed casket funeral, never questioning why the bodies were never shown, never wondering why the family's prestigious lawyer was the one who handled the hospital records instead of the police. She had stepped into the vacuum left by Chitty's death, adopting the newborn Amara with a heart full of penance, believing she was saving a child from the wreckage of a tragic, illicit love affair. Now, standing in her modern Ikoyi kitchen while the espresso machine hissed like a cornered snake, Nneka realized that her entire adult life had been built upon a foundation of curated silences. The accident hadn't been an end, but a transition, a strategic removal of 2 inconvenient people from the family's pristine social ledger. As she stared at the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows, she recalled the way her father had looked at her when she signed the adoption papers. It wasn't a look of sympathy, but of clinical satisfaction. He hadn't been giving her a daughter. He had been burying a scandal in the most effective way possible, by giving it to someone who would love it and protect it with her very life. The realization that Chitty might not have died that night, or that Julian had been allowed to survive while Chitty was erased, sent a cold shiver down Neka's spine. Every lullaby she had sung to Amara, every school play she had attended, and every fever she had nursed felt like a transaction in a currency she didn't realize was counterfeit. She wasn't the savior of an orphan. She was the custodian of a secret that was finally, after 21 years, clawing its way out of the red earth of the past. Breakfast was a masterclass in psychological warfare, served with a side of fresh papaya and artisanal honey. Amara sat across from Neka, her posture impeccable, her eyes focused on her phone as if the previous night's tectonic shift in their relationship hadn't occurred. There was no trace of the affectionate daughter who used to call Neka mummy, with a warmth that could melt the hardest heart. In her place was a cool, detached stranger who moved through the house with the predatory grace of a cat. When Neka finally broke the silence, her voice cracking slightly, Amara didn't even look up. Amara, we need to talk about Julian. We need to talk about why you call me your aunt, Neka said, her hands trembling beneath the table. Amara finally raised her gaze, and for the first time, Neka saw the calculation behind those dark irises. It was a look of profound, ancient disappointment, as if Amara had been waiting years for Neka to catch up to a truth she had already mastered. Why does the label matter so much to you, Neka? Amara asked, her voice devoid of emotion. You've always been so obsessed with the image of our lives. I'm just giving you a role that fits the reality of the paperwork. You were a guardian, a provider. But you weren't the beginning of my story. The cruelty of the statement was delivered with such casual elegance that Neka felt the air leave her lungs. She watched Amara methodically slice her fruit, the silver knife clicking against the porcelain plate with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. This was the girl Neka had sheltered from the harsh realities of Lagos, the girl she had sent to the best schools in London and Switzerland, only for her to return with a heart made of ice and a mind sharpened for betrayal. Neka realized then that the slow build of Amara's resentment must have been happening for years, fueled by letters from Julian or perhaps by her own investigative prowess. Amara wasn't just a daughter looking for her father. She was a judge presiding over Neka's life, and the verdict had already been reached. As Amara rose from the table, smoothing her designer skirt, and heading toward the door without a second glance, Neka saw the mask slip just for a second, a flicker of something that looked like triumph. It wasn't just about Julian. It was about the power of a narrative, and Amara had seized the pen from Neka's hand, ready to rewrite the history of their bloodline in a way that left Neka as nothing more than a footnote in her own home. Desperation drove Neka to a small, nondescript office in Suralere, far from the polished surfaces of her corporate life. Tund, a former detective with a reputation for finding people who didn't want to be found, sat behind a desk cluttered with old files and the lingering scent of stale coffee. Neka laid out the newborn bracelet and the photo of Julian on the desk, her heart pounding in her ears. She explained the accident of 2005, the sudden reappearance of a dead man, and the missing files from her safe. Tund listened with the practiced patience of a man who had seen the underbelly of Nigeria's elite, his eyes never leaving Neka's face. When she finished, he didn't offer comfort. He offered a grim reality check. In this country, people with enough money don't just die. They are erased or they are reinvented, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. If Julian Silas is alive, it means someone paid a fortune to keep him that way, and even more to keep him hidden. You're not just looking for a ghost, madam. You're looking for the person who held the pen when his death certificate was signed. And usually, that person is closer than you think. The investigation began that afternoon, and within 48 hours, Tund had uncovered the first crack in the foundation of Neka's past. He called her to a quiet corner of a park in Ikoyi, handing her a digital tablet filled with scans of old police logs from the night of the crash. There was no record of a male passenger in the car with Chitty, only a John Doe who had been whisked away in a private ambulance before the official report could be filed. Even more disturbing was the discovery that Julian hadn't been in hiding abroad. He had been living in a coastal town near Betrayal for over a decade, supported by a monthly stipend from shell company linked to Neka's own family estate. Neka felt a cold, hollow sensation in her chest as the pieces began to click into place. Her father, the patriarch she had always feared and respected, hadn't just faked a death. He had maintained a living ghost, keeping Julian on a leash like a secret insurance policy. The betrayal was multi-layered, a labyrinth of lies that spanned generations, and as Tun scrolled through the financial records, Neka realized that the money used to keep Julian alive had been drawn from the very trust fund she had managed for Amar's future. The journey to the Ministry of Justice archives was a descent into the dusty, bureaucratic heart of Lagos, a place where secrets were buried under layers of red tape and the smell of decomposing paper. Neka spent hours in the sweltering heat of the record room, her fingers stained with ink as she searched for the original adoption decree. She was looking for the signature of the judge, the seal of the court, the proof that her motherhood was sanctioned by the state. But as she finally laid eyes on the ledger from 2005, her breath hitched. The entry for Amar's adoption was a ghost file. The numbers skipped from 1042 to 1044, with the middle entry neatly excised with a razor blade. There was no legal record of Neka ever adopting a child. The paper she had held in her safe for 20 years, the one she had looked at whenever she felt the pangs of imposter syndrome as a mother, had been high-quality forgeries. She wasn't just an aunt in Amara's eyes. She was a woman who had been living a legal fiction, a high-stakes role play orchestrated by her father to keep the family's assets and secrets within a controlled orbit. Neka leaned against the cold metal shelves of the archive, the weight of the realization making her knees buckle. If the adoption wasn't legal, then Amara was still, in the eyes of the law, the daughter of Julian Silas and the late Chitty, or whoever Chitty had become. The power Neka thought she had as a parent was an illusion, a house of cards that Julian and Amara were now blowing down with calculated precision. She thought of the countless times she had used those papers for school enrollments, for travel visas, for the very foundations of Amara's life, and realized that her father's influence must have reached into every corner of the government to allow such a massive fraud to go undetected. She wasn't the master of her own destiny. She was a pawn in a game that was played before she even knew the rules. As she walked out of the ministry into the chaotic noise of the Lagos traffic, the city felt like a predatory beast, its shadows lengthening and its secrets whispering from every corner. She was a mother without a child, a sister without a history, and a woman who was beginning to realize that the only person she could trust was the one person she had never truly known, herself. The invitation to dinner was sent by Amara, not Neka, a subtle but devastating shift in the domestic hierarchy. When Neka arrived home that evening, the dining table was set for three, with the fine china and the heavy silver that was usually reserved for Christmas or high-profile business associates. Julian was already there, standing on the balcony with a glass of scotch, his silhouette framed by the setting sun that turned the Lagos lagoon into a pool of liquid fire. He looked at home in a way that made Neka's skin crawl, as if he had merely stepped out for a walk 20 years ago and had finally returned to claim his rightful chair. Amara was at his side, laughing at something he said, a sound that Neka realized she hadn't heard in months. The dinner was a performance of normalcy that was more terrifying than an outright confrontation. They discussed the economy, the new infrastructure projects in Lekki, and Amara's plans for her master's degree, all while Julian's eyes remained fixed on Neka with a predatory, mocking intensity. He was savoring her discomfort, enjoying the way she flinched whenever he referred to Amara as my girl or the image of her mother. As the main course was served, the air in the room grew thick with the unspoken. Julian reached out, his hand covering Amara's on the table, a gesture of fatherly affection that felt like a declaration of war. "It's remarkable, isn't it, Neka?" he said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "How the blood always finds its way back. No matter how much paper you pile on top of it, the truth has a way of breathing." Neka couldn't eat. Every bite felt like dry sand in her throat. She looked at her daughter, the girl she had raised, the girl who knew her favorite color, her fears, her dreams, and saw a stranger who was actively participating in her mother's erasure. Amara looked back at her with a chilling neutrality, as if she were observing a business rival rather than the woman who had spent 20 years loving her. When Julian raised his glass in a toast to new beginnings and old truths, Nneka realized that this dinner wasn't an attempt at reconciliation. It was an eviction notice. They were telling her, without saying the words, that her time as the protagonist of this family story was over, and that the man she had once loved and the daughter she still adored were now a unified front against her. The plastic newborn bracelet haunted Nneka's thoughts, its cheap material a stark contrast to the luxury of her current life. She knew the name of the clinic, St. Jude's, a small, private facility in a quiet corner of Enugu that had long since been shuttered after a suspicious fire in late 2005. Following a lead from Tund, Nneka traveled back to her childhood city, a place of red dust and painful memories. She found the site of the clinic, now an overgrown lot where the charred remains of the foundation were hidden by tall grass and discarded plastic. After hours of questioning locals, she was directed to a small house on the outskirts of town where a retired nurse named Sister Agatha lived. Agatha was a woman of 80, her memory sharp as a needle despite her frail frame. When Nneka showed her the photo of the bracelet and mentioned the night of the accident, the old woman's face paled, and she made the sign of the cross. "That night was not an accident, my daughter," Agatha whispered, her eyes darting to the door as if the ghosts of 2005 were still listening. "The man, the one you called Julian, he wasn't brought in by an ambulance. He was brought in by men in black cars, men who didn't want names recorded." Agatha revealed that the clinic hadn't burned down because of a faulty wire. It had been torched to destroy the records of a very specific birth. She remembered Chitty, the beautiful one with the eyes of a trapped bird, who had been kept in a private wing away from the other patients. Chitty hadn't died in a car crash. She had died in that clinic, not from injuries, but from a complication that Agatha hinted was far more sinister than a typical medical error. "The man, Julian, he sat by her bed, but he wasn't crying," Agatha said, her voice trembling. "He was waiting. He was waiting for the child to be born, and for the men in the cars to tell him what his life was worth." Nneka felt the world tilt. The story she had been told, that Chitty and Julian were together in the car, was a fabrication. Chitty had been a prisoner of her own family's reputation, and Julian had been the witness, or perhaps the accomplice, to her final moments. The bracelet wasn't just a record of birth. It was a receipt for a life exchanged. As Nneka left Agatha's house, the red dust of Enugu felt like blood on her shoes, and the truth about Julian's role in her sister's death began to take a much darker, more calculated shape. Back in Lagos, the tension reached a breaking point one night when Julian cornered Nneka in the dimly lit hallway of her own home. Amara was out, and the house felt cavernous, the shadows stretching across the walls like grasping fingers. Julian didn't hide his disdain anymore. The mask of the charming guest had been discarded, leaving behind the cold, transactional man Agatha had described. He blocked Nneka's path to her bedroom, his presence an oppressive weight in the narrow space. "You look tired, Nneka," he said, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "It must be exhausting, trying to hold onto a lie that's already dead." Nneka found a spark of her old fire, her anger momentarily eclipsing her fear. "I love you, Julian. I grieve for you. I raised your daughter when I thought you were in the ground," she hissed, her voice shaking with the weight of 2 decades of misplaced devotion. Julian leaned in close, his face inches from hers, and for a second, Nneka saw the absolute void in his eyes. "That's the tragedy, isn't it?" he said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "You were always the one who loved too much, who believed too easily. Loving you was never part of the plan, Nneka. You were the safe harbor, the one who would keep the asset, Amara, secure until the time was right for the payout." The word asset hit Nneka harder than any physical blow. To Julian, his own daughter wasn't a person. She was a strategic advantage, a way back into the wealth and power of the family that had once cast him out. He admitted, with a chilling lack of remorse, that he had never intended to marry Chitty, that their love affair had been a way to leverage himself into the family estate. When Chitty became pregnant, the stakes changed, and Neka's father had stepped in to orchestrate a disappearance that suited everyone except Chitty. Neka realized with a sickening jolt that Julian hadn't been a victim of her father's ruthlessness. He had been a collaborator. He had agreed to die in exchange for a life of quiet luxury and the promise that one day he would return to claim what was his. As he walked away, leaving her gasping in the dark hallway, Neka understood the full extent of her isolation. She wasn't just losing her daughter. She was realizing that the man she had held up as a romantic martyr was the very architect of her sister's ruin and her own 20-year deception. The search for Chitty's voice led Neka to the one place she had avoided for 20 years, the dusty, spider-webbed attic of their family estate in Enugu, which she had inherited after her father's death. Among the crates of old financial records and moth-eaten linens, she found a small, locked wooden box with Chitty's initials carved into the lid. Her hands shook as she pried it open with a screwdriver, revealing a collection of dried flowers, old concert tickets, and a leather-bound diary. As Neka read the entries from the months leading up to the accident, a different Chitty emerged, not the reckless girl of family legend, but a woman who was terrified, trapped, and beginning to see the true nature of the man she had chosen. Chitty wrote about Julian's sudden mood swings, his obsession with the family's wealth, and her growing suspicion that he was reporting her every move to their father. "He doesn't love me," one entry read, the ink blurred by what looked like tears. "He loves the idea of who I am, the key I provide to a world he was never meant to enter. And now that I'm carrying his child, I am no longer a person to him. I am a hostage." The diary chronicled a harrowing descent into paranoia. Chitty had discovered the plan to remove her before she could bring shame to the family, a plan Julian was actively helping to facilitate in exchange for a settlement. The last entry, dated 3 days before the clinic fire, was a frantic plea for Neka to help her. "Neka, if you're reading this, know that they are coming for us. They say it's for the best, that the baby needs a proper mother, not a scandal. Don't believe them. Don't believe Julian." Neka sat on the floor of the attic, the diary clutched to her chest as she sobbed, not just for Chitty, but for the 20 years she had spent unknowingly serving the man who had destroyed her sister. She had been chosen to raise Amara because she was the proper one, the reliable one who would never ask questions. Her father and Julian had used her grief as a tool to polish their own sins. The realization was a catalyst, a white-hot anger that began to burn away the last of Neka's fear. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a witness with a dead woman's testimony in her hands, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a cold, clear sense of purpose. The full scope of the 2005 betrayal was a masterpiece of corporate and familial engineering. Through Chitty's diary and Tun's continued digging into the financial shadows, Neka reconstructed the final days of her sister's life. It wasn't just a matter of family honor. It was a matter of a multi-million-dollar merger between her father's company and a British firm that had a strict morality clause. A pregnant, unmarried daughter and a boyfriend with a criminal record would have tanked the deal. Her father hadn't just been protecting his name. He had been protecting his bottom line. Julian, ever the opportunist, had seen the writing on the wall and approached Neka's father with a deal. He would disappear, and Chitty would be handled, in exchange for a lifetime of support and a future stake in the company once the heat had died down and the child was grown. The accident was a carefully staged theater piece, complete with a decoy car and paid-off officials, designed to give Neka a reason to take the child and never look back. Chitty's death at the clinic hadn't been an accident. It was a medical necessity when she threatened to go to the press with the truth of the deal. Neka realized that the man she had loved was the one who had literally negotiated the price of her sister's life. Every time she had visited Chitty's grave, Julian was probably a few miles away, living on the blood money her father had provided. The horror of it was compounded by the fact that Julian was now back to collect on the second half of that 20-year-old contract. Amara was the final piece of the puzzle, the heir who would bridge the gap between Julian and the family fortune. Nneka saw the game now. She was the only obstacle to a total takeover. If Julian could convince Amara that Nneka was a liar and a thief who had stolen her from her real father, Amara would gladly hand him the keys to the empire Nneka had built. The betrayal wasn't just a past event. It was an ongoing process, a slow-motion heist where the prize wasn't just money, but Nneka's very soul and her relationship with the girl she called her daughter. She had been the unwitting banker for a deal signed in blood, and the debt collectors had finally arrived at her door. In the cold light of day, the staged death of Julian Silas felt like a blueprint for a haunting. Nneka visited the site of the original crash, the ravine along the expressway now covered in decades of lush tropical growth. Standing on the edge of the asphalt, she could almost hear the echoes of the sirens and the staged chaos. Tund had found the man who had driven the second car, a retired driver for the family who, in his twilight years and plagued by guilt, admitted that the car Chitty was in had never gone off the road. They took her to the clinic while the ambulance took the empty car into the valley. The old man had confessed, his eyes clouded with cataracts. "I saw her screaming, madam. I saw her calling for you." That image, Chitty calling for his sister who was probably at home, oblivious and mourning, shattered something inside Nneka. She had been the one Chitty trusted most, and she had been the one who had inadvertently benefited most from her sister's erasure, inheriting the child and the status that came with being the perfect daughter who stepped up in a crisis. The sophistication of the lie was breathtaking. Even the funeral had been a calculated risk, a way to bind Nneka to the secret without her ever knowing she was keeping it. Her father had gambled on Nneka's inherent goodness, her desire to do right by the family, and her love for Amara. He knew she would never dig too deep because the truth would be too painful to bear. But he hadn't counted on Amara. He hadn't counted on the child of that betrayal growing up with the same sharp, manipulative instincts as the men who had orchestrated her birth. As Nneka stood by the ravine, she realized that Julian's death was the most successful project her father had ever managed. It had lasted 20 years, long enough for the participants to die or become complacent. But Julian was tired of being a ghost, and he had found a willing medium in Amara. The staged death was over. The resurrection was in full swing, and Nneka was the only one who knew that the man coming back to life was a monster who had helped kill the woman he claimed to love. Nneka waited until she was certain Amara and Julian were out, likely at one of those reunion lunches that were becoming increasingly frequent. She entered Amara's bedroom, a space that had always been a sanctuary of pink and white, but now felt like a sterile, high-tech command center. She sat at Amara's desk and opened her laptop. The password, Chitty 2005, was a twist of a knife. Once inside, Nneka found a hidden partition titled The Chronicle. It was a digital archive of a 3-year investigation. Amara hadn't just found Julian. She had hunted him. She had tracked the shell companies, hacked into old family emails, and even obtained copies of Chitty's medical records that Nneka didn't even know existed. But the most shocking find was a folder of correspondence between Amara and Julian dating back to when she was 18. The letters weren't full of daughterly affection. They were tactical. Amara had been the one to coach Julian on how to reappear, how to manipulate Nneka's guilt, and how to slowly isolate her from their social circle. The daughter Nneka had raised wasn't a victim of Julian's manipulation. She was his mentor. Amara had analyzed Nneka's psychological profile with a cold, clinical precision, identifying her mother's obsession with legacy and her deep-seated guilt over Chitty's death as the primary vulnerabilities. "She will break if we push the aunt narrative," one email from Amara to Julian read. "She needs to feel that her motherhood was a theft. Once she loses her moral high ground, she will hand over the keys to the trust just to stay in my life." Nneka felt a wave of coldness wash over her that no Lego sun could ever warm. She realized she had raised a predator who viewed love as a weakness to be exploited. Amara didn't want a father. She wanted an ally to help her seize the full power of the family estate before Nneka could waste any more of it on her charity foundations or business expansions. The room, with its childhood stuffed animals and expensive perfumes, suddenly felt like a cage. Neka realized that for years, while she was kissing Amara goodnight, the girl had been planning her mother's professional and emotional execution. The realization that Amara was the puppet master shifted the entire landscape of the conflict. Neka no longer saw a daughter to be saved. She saw an adversary to be survived. She spent the next few days playing the part of the broken, confused aunt, watching as Amara and Julian moved through her house with increasing arrogance. They began to make changes, redecorating the living room, inviting Julian's associates over, and discussing the liquidation of certain assets as if Neka weren't in the room. Amara's brilliance was in her subtlety. She never shouted, never made a scene. She simply withdrew the affection that had been Neka's lifeblood, replacing it with a polite, frigid distance that made Neka feel like a ghost in her own home. She watched Julian, too, seeing how he deferred to Amara on key decisions. He was the muscle, the face of the past, but Amara was the brain. She had inherited the worst of both worlds, the ruthless ambition of the grandfather she never knew and the manipulative charm of the father who had sold her soul before she was born. Neka began to see the pattern in their movements. They were aiming for a total takeover of the family holding company by the end of the quarter. To do this, they needed Neka to sign a transfer of management document, citing her declining mental health or desire for retirement as the reason. Amara had already started planting the seeds with the board of directors, whispering about Neka's erratic behavior and her unhealthy obsession with the past. It was a classic Legos power play, executed with a surgical precision that made Neka wonder if she had ever truly known the child she called her own. But the puppet master had one weakness. She believed Neka was too weak to fight back. Amara's entire plan relied on Neka's love for her being a paralyzing force. As Neka watched them from the shadows of the hallway, she realized that the only way to stop them was to stop being the mother they expected her to be. She needed to become the woman her father had actually trained her to be, a cold, calculating operator who knew exactly where the bodies were buried, because she was the one who had been carrying the shovel. The showdown didn't happen in a boardroom or a dark alley. It happened in the quiet, manicured garden of the Ikoyi estate, under the heavy scent of jasmine and the distant hum of the city. Neka called them both out after dinner, her voice steady and her gaze iron hard. She didn't lead with tears. She led with the wooden box from the attic. "I found Chitty's diary," she said, placing it on the stone table between them. "I know about the deal in 2005. I know Julian wasn't a victim, and I know Chitty didn't die in a car." Julian's face hardened, his eyes darting to Amara, but the girl didn't flinch. She simply leaned back in her chair, a look of mild boredom on her face. "So you found a book," Amara said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What does that change? You're still the woman who spent 20 years living a lie, Neka. You're the one who took me from my real parents to satisfy your own guilt. If anything, this just proves why you're unfit to manage the legacy." Neka felt a surge of adrenaline, a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. "I didn't take you, Amara. I was the only thing standing between you and the garbage heap your real father was willing to leave you on. He sold you. He sold your mother. And now he's here to sell you again." She turned to Julian, her eyes burning with a 20-year-old fire. "I have the police logs, Julian. I have a nurse's testimony. And I have the financial records showing every kobo my father paid to keep you in that hole in Betrayal. If you think you're walking into this company, you're mistaken. You're walking into a courtroom." For the first time, Julian looked genuinely rattled. The slow build of his confidence began to crumble as he realized Neka hadn't been breaking. She had been arming herself. But Amara was quicker. She stood up, her face a mask of cold fury. "You think anyone will believe you? You're the aunt who kidnapped a child and faked an adoption. You go to court, and we both go down. But I'm young, Neka. I can survive the scandal. Can you?" The argument in the garden revealed the terrifying depth of Amara's twisted logic. She didn't care about the morality of what had happened in 2005. She cared about the symmetry of it. To her, the truth was a tool, not a revelation. "Don't you see, Neka?" she said, her voice dropping to a low, hypnotic pitch. "We were always meant to raise me together. You have the money and the name, and he has the blood and the truth. Between the three of us, we are untouchable. Why fight for a morality that Chitty and my grandfather already destroyed? We could be the perfect family now, the one that doesn't need to hide anymore." She spoke of a new order where the three of them would rule the family holdings as a triumvirate, where the past would be rewritten as a necessary sacrifice for their current greatness. She actually believed that Julian's betrayal of Chitty was a sign of his strength, a quality she admired more than Neka's soft devotion. She was offering Neka a seat at a table built on her sister's bones, and she genuinely seemed to think it was a generous offer. Neka looked at the two of them, the man who had killed her sister's soul and the daughter who had inherited his darkness, and felt a profound sense of loss. The Amara she had loved was gone, or perhaps she had never existed. The girl standing before her was a creature of pure ambition, a modern Lagos aristocrat who saw people as chess pieces. "You call it fate," Neka said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's just a crime that hasn't been punished yet." Amara smiled, a chillingly beautiful expression. "A crime is only a crime if you lose, Annie. And we aren't losing. Julian and I have already moved the offshore accounts. The board is meeting tomorrow to finalize the transition. You can either be part of the new family, or you can be the woman who lost everything trying to avenge a ghost." The twisted logic was a trap. If Neka fought them, she destroyed the life Amara had. But if she joined them, she destroyed herself. Amara was banking on Neka's inability to hurt the child she had raised, even if that child was now holding a knife to her throat. The night after the confrontation, Neka sat in her room, the silence of the house a physical pressure against her eardrums. She realized that the bond was truly broken, not by Julian's arrival, but by Amara's acceptance of him. Every memory of their life together felt tainted, like a beautiful film that had been edited to include a monster in every frame. She thought of the birthdays, the graduations, the quiet moments of mother-daughter confidence, and wondered how much of it had been real on Amara's end. Had she always felt this distance? Had she always been looking for a way to optimize her family? The pain was a deep, dull ache in her chest, the kind of grief that doesn't end in tears but in a cold, hard resolve. She looked at a photo of her sister Chitty and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. Chitty had been the first victim, and Neka had been the second. She would not allow herself to be the third. She would not become a ghost in her own life to satisfy the greed of a man and a girl who valued power over blood. She began to pack a small bag, not to flee, but to move. She needed to step outside the narrative they had constructed for her. If they wanted a declining woman, she would give them a disappearing one. She realized that her power didn't come from the house in Ikoyi or the title on her office door. It came from the truth she held in the wooden box. Amara thought she had one because she had the accounts and the board, but Neka had the one thing that Lagos high society feared more than poverty, the unvarnished, ugly truth. As she looked at the photo of Amara one last time, she didn't see her daughter. She saw the final legacy of her father's ruthlessness. The bond wasn't just broken, it was incinerated. She walked out of the bedroom, leaving the lights on and the door unlocked, a signal that she was no longer a prisoner of her own sanctuary. She was moving into the shadows, and for the first time in 20 years, she was doing it without the weight of a child on her back. For a week, Neka stayed in a modest apartment in Acadia, watching from afar as the new family made their debut. Julian and Amara were seen everywhere, galas, charity auctions, and high-level business dinners. The narrative they were spinning was one of a long-lost father miraculously reunited with his daughter, a story that the Lagos elites swallowed whole because it was romantic and distracting. Julian was being hailed as a tragic figure who had finally come home, and Amara was the brilliant heiress who had brought him back. They were a powerful duo, their combined charisma and wealth making them the new darlings of the social scene. Neka watched the social media feeds, saw the photos of them laughing together, and realized that they were already erasing her. To the world, she was the eccentric aunt who had stepped back for health reasons, a footnote in the grand story of the Silas Amara reunion. They were building their empire on a foundation of lies, and they were doing it with an arrogance that only comes from thinking you've already won. But Nneka wasn't just watching, she was working. With Tun's help, she was orchestrating a countermove that would hit them where they were most vulnerable, their reputation. She wasn't going to the police, who could be bought. She was going to the one person who could destroy them with a single headline. She met with the editor of the city's most influential investigative magazine, a woman who had a personal vendetta against the kind of big man politics that Nneka's father had represented. Nneka laid out everything: the fake accident, the clinic fire, the diary, and the financial records. She gave her the aunt introduction, the missing papers, and the emails from Amara's laptop. "I don't want a settlement," Nneka told the editor. "I want the truth to be the only thing left standing when the dust clears. I want the world to see the new family for what they really are, a collection of predators and ghosts." The editor looked at the evidence, a grim smile on her face. "This isn't just a story, Madam Nneka. This is a demolition." The magazine hit the stands on the morning of the annual Silas Foundation Gala, the very event where Julian was set to be named chairman. The headline was a scream: "The Blood Contract, the secret death and staged life of the Silas Empire." By the time the gala started, the digital version had already gone viral across West Africa and beyond. Nneka didn't hide. She walked into the ballroom of the Intercontinental Hotel, the same emerald gown she had worn at the first gala, now feeling like a suit of armor. The room went silent as she entered. Julian and Amara stood on the stage, the teleprompters frozen, their faces pale and drawn as they watched the woman they thought they had defeated walk toward them. Nneka didn't say a word. She simply took a seat at the front table, her table, and looked up at them with a calm, terrifying neutrality. She saw the panic in Julian's eyes and the simmering, impotent rage in Amara's. They couldn't kick her out without making the scandal worse, and they couldn't ignore her because she was the only one who held the original documents. As the evening unfolded and the guests began to whisper and drift away, Nneka realized the final truth of her journey. She hadn't lost a daughter. She had been freed from a role that was never meant for her. She looked at Amara, who was now desperately trying to manage the PR disaster on her phone, and felt a flicker of something that wasn't love, but a cold, clinical understanding. Amara knew exactly what she was doing, but she hadn't accounted for a mother who would prioritize justice over a broken relationship. Julian reached out to take Nneka's hand, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to play the lover and soften the blow, whispering that he never stopped loving her. Nneka pulled her hand away, her voice clear and carrying across the front row. "Loving me was never the plan, Julian, but surviving you was." She realized that by letting go of the lie of her motherhood, she had reclaimed her own life. As she walked out of the gala alone, the Lagos night felt vast and full of possibility. The shadows were still there, but they were no longer her enemies. They were the places where she had finally found the light. She didn't want a mother. She wanted a partner in crime. "I realized then that I hadn't raised a daughter. I've been feeding the girl who was destined to destroy me. This is how I burned their empire to the ground. Like and follow for the final revelation."